Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And in this video I'm going to be reimagining the bedroom from the original Game Boy Pokémon game as isometric pixel art. The original room is of course in a top-down style, which is honestly quite a favorite of mine, but isometric art is also a really interesting format because it feels like you get a better sense of things actually looking kind of three-dimensional, since you're able to actually see three faces of an object rather than just two. I'm making this on a canvas size of 160 by 144 pixels, which is the sizing for the Game Boy, and I've also kept the extreme edges of the room tucked in from the sides by about 16 pixels. Since in the original, that room is actually just 128 by 128 pixels within that Game Boy canvas. I like the idea that it could be about the same size as that one, despite being this totally different construction format. So to get started here, I've laid in the initial walls and the floor, and you can see that those are all built at this particular angle composed of 2 pixel segments, which is kind of the magic number when preparing typical isometric perspective. What I'm doing now is detailing these areas with similar tiling patterns as the original. And I think it's kind of funny that in the original, the tile pattern along the floor was actually running at an angle. So now that we're looking at the room from an angle, I figured I should straighten out that tile pattern to account for this new perspective. So that one's actually pretty easy. And then for the walls, I'm putting in the stripy pattern, again following that 2 pixel angle. And I've done each wall in a different color scheme. There's sort of a shaded side and a light side, and that's just to help with the dimensionality here, and kind of being able to spot that there's 2 different walls. Another thing I like for isometric art is just giving a bit of volume to the walls too. Like adding a top edge and some faces at the sides. I think it makes it look sort of like a cutaway part of a structure and just feels a bit more sturdy in a way. Okay, before starting to fill the room, I actually want to make a sprite of red so that it can help in figuring out the relative sizing of all the objects that are going to go in the room. If I started by making the objects first, I'd be more concerned that I'd end up making them maybe a bit too small and then not be able to fit in a nice looking character sprite to go with them. So I'm going to start here and then size things like the table and the bed and everything like that based on the character. I've been thinking of putting together a proper tutorial for isometric character construction, partly because I'd like to do more study of that myself. But for now with this one, my sort of loose approach here was basically to start with a readable head and then blob in a silhouette for the body and kind of bash everything into place from there. A lot of it is just about keeping the character aligned with those isometric angles. So things like the hands and feet and the eyes also, they end up getting offset vertically from one another depending on which direction the character is facing. The final version of this sprite ended up being 24 pixels tall, which is actually 1 tile higher than the original sprite. And hopefully you can tell also, but I went for the backwards hat styling since that's kind of my favorite look for Red after seeing that look almost exclusively for him in the manga series. Alright, with that character sprite in place, we can start sizing out the objects for the room. Now, when I first started doing isometric pixel art, one of the things I found difficult, or cumbersome I guess, was just the amount of effort that it took in making sure that all the little object sprites would follow these isometric grid lines. It felt like a lot of work to have to build everything up like that for each sprite. And what I've found to be way faster and more consistent also is to generate a few building blocks ahead of time that you can then combine to form the basic structure of your object. And then once you have this combined form, all you have to do is basically paint over the faces and, maybe make a few other slight adjustments if needed. So in this case, I've got a couple basic cube structures as my stock pieces. The small one there is 8 by 8 pixels, and the larger one is 16 by 16. And I only chose those sizes because I liked that they'd follow the tile sizing of the Game Boy, but you could really start with any kind of sizes and shapes, I guess. Also, the reason I only use cubes for this was mainly because it's just boxy shaped objects anyway, like there's shelves and TVs and stuff like that. But if you want to see other examples, I actually did a more in-depth tutorial earlier this year about this modular approach to isometric pixel art. And that one had a few more shapes and some details for buildings and stuff, so I definitely recommend that video if you're interested in more of this kind of thing. I also wanted to mention that at this point in the drawing, I thought I'd reference the artwork from Pokémon Fire Red, which is the remake of the original game for the Game Boy Advance. That one had a rework to the sprite designs themselves and the actual room layout a little bit. And it's quite a good interpretation to reference here, so for mine, there's a bit of inspiration that pulls from both versions. So with all the objects done, I'm going to turn that room layer back on, and we can start placing everything within it. And for the most part, it's looking pretty good, but it doesn't take too long to notice that the space in here is getting a little bit tight. And honestly, I don't really mind this because I always found that the original was pretty spacious anyway, but this is just a bit too far to the other side of that spectrum, I suppose. Luckily, there's a couple things we can do to free up some space here. The first thing I'm going to do is to scale down the objects just a tiny bit by selecting parts of them and then dragging them in a little bit. When making these adjustments, I'm being sure to move them according to that isometric angle of the 2-pixel line segment. And it kind of helps that these things are boxy enough and have enough excess plane areas to be able to pinch them in like this. So this is definitely helping quite a bit, but I'd still like a bit more room because I was hoping to fit that staircase into the corner, obviously. So the second adjustment is to actually scale out the walls and the floor a little bit more. And I'm just going to bump them out by one more tile. Just because I still want to have a slight buffer to the edge of the canvas. And that's looking pretty good. Just a couple small adjustments here and there feel like they're offering the space that we need. Another thing that I noticed though is that some of the object outlines that were using the purple color are now getting lost along that purple wall. So I'm just going to go through and paint those over in black to make sure that they're still visible. And that reminds me, I actually can't believe I didn't mention this earlier. I usually do this earlier in the video. But the color palette that I'm using for this piece is called the Pokémon Super Game Boy palette. It's one of the palettes that you'd see when playing on the Game Boy Color or when using the Super Game Boy cart for the Super Nintendo. I guess there were always a few palettes presented. I remember it kind of switching, maybe depending on what town you were in or something like that. But this is the one that I tend to think of the most for this game, aside from probably the classic Game Boy Green, obviously. But you can find this palette on low spec. It's a really nicely balanced set of colors. It's easy to work with. And even outside of its association with the game, it's just got this really nice sunset sort of look that feels like it's got nostalgia already baked into it, you know? So at this point, I'm just doing a lap around the room and trying to fill out other details like the windows and decorations here and there. There's a couple references to in-game items. But I don't want the footage to spoil the end result here, so let's just go ahead and take a look at how the final thing came together. Here we go. Alright, so obviously we couldn't have a piece like this without any Pokemon in it, so the last additions here were the Pikachu and Poliwhirl sprites. And I sort of blobbed those in with rounded shapes before dropping in their main color and detailing from there. I actually found these two to be pretty forgiving in this format, probably because they're quite small anyway. And just to bring things full circle, I wanted to pull up a comparison to the original room. Obviously, how do you compare with something as iconic as that original art? But at least in the isometric version, one of the things I really liked was how the form factor came out. It feels kind of crowded in there, but it's in this way that's believable as a real bedroom. And it's actually just neat to see things from another angle like this too. Before we close out, here it is in a few other palettes as well, with the gray and the green in there as sort of typical Game Boy presentations. And the reddish one might have been me subconsciously representing for the red cartridge. That's the one that I had. Might need to make one for the rival blue now just to balance things out at this point, I don't know. But let's end with some CRT time. So thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.